SDI. What was that? It's on.
Hi, everybody. How you doing tonight? I'm pretty good. Thank you for the enthusiasm. And also, thank you for your patience. You may have seen we had a little bit of trouble with the screen up here. It seems to be fixed. Thank you very much, everyone who worked on it. But if it gives us more trouble tonight, please bear with us. You know, broken cables, it's a nightmare. My name is Aidan Flax-Clark, and I'm part of the team that brings you live from NYPL. So just so glad to see all of you here tonight. We have a packed room. I think we have a ton of people watching online. So between that, we have a really incredible crowd. And wherever you are, thank you so much for being with us. Pulitzer Prize-winning sociologist Matthew Desmond's new book is Poverty by America, and is arguably one of the most important books you will read this year, and quite possibly for many years to come. I'm not going to say much about it since that's what he's here to do, but I loved what Margaret Talbot said about it in The New Yorker. She said, poverty deserves to be one of those books you see people reading on the subway or handing around at organizing meetings or citing in congressional hearings. Its moral force is a gut punch. I agree. And if you haven't read it yet, we have many ways for you to get your hands on a copy of the book. First and foremost, our friends from the library shop over here are selling copies of it, and I believe that Matthew will be signing them afterwards. If you're watching online, there should be a link coming in the chat now where you can purchase it from the shop as well. All proceeds go to benefit the New York Public Library. And of course, you can also get it with your library card. We've got it in paper. We've got it on Simply E, our app. You can even get it as an audiobook. And obviously, all of you have your library cards, yes? Okay. Because we would have trouble if you did not. Matthew is speaking with another one of my favorite writers, Andrea Elliott, who is a fellow Pulitzer Prize awardee. She's the author of the genre-defining book of narrative journalism, Invisible Child, which is quite simply one of the best books you'll ever read. It is also for sale here tonight. You can also get it with your library card, and I very much urge you to get that one as well. In addition to winning the Pulitzer Prize, Andrea also won the library's Helen Bernstein Book Award for Excellence in Journalism, so she's kind of a hometown favorite around the library. I'm really excited to hear both of them talk. Coming up at Live in May, we have some really excellent events, and I hope to see you again. Next week, the former head of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, Sherilyn Ifill, is going to be here. She's going to deliver the annual Robert B. Silvers Lecture, which this year is titled How America Ends and Begins Again. So very dystopian and also a little bit of hope in there, we hope. David Remnick is going to be here talking about music writing. Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah is going to be here talking about his incredible new novel, Chain Gang All-Stars. And our monthly rooftop happy hour across the street at the SNF Library will be on May 26th with readings curated by our friends at Singapore Unbound. All of these are free. All of them are at nypl.org/live. Please come back to them, check out what else we have going on, and also sign up for our newsletter. Okay, so if you're in the room, you will have seen note cards on your chairs. These are for asking questions, which we would love you to do. Some of my colleagues will be coming around picking them up periodically, and we'll collect them and get them up to the stage for Matthew to answer. If you're watching online, you can put your question in the chat, or you can email publicprograms@nypl.org, and we will get those as well. So wherever you are, we'd love to hear your questions, and really, please send as many as you have. Lastly, Live from NYPL is made possible by the continuing generosity of Celeste Bartos, Manaz Isbahani Bartos, and Adam Bartos, and of course, all of you. So thank you very much for your support. Thank you very much for being here. And now let's give it up for Andrea Elliott and Matthew Desmond.
Good evening, everyone. How are you doing, Matt?
I'm ready.
You're
I'm ready.
Okay.
I'm grateful.
Good, because this book blew me away. It just blew me away. I think partly for the same reason that Evicted got me, which is that there is no author, no academic, no public intellectual who has, like you have, awakened America to what poverty represents, which is a relationship, the relationship. And so I wanted to begin there and to ask you to explain to us what relationship we're in. What is this relationship?
Right. You know, I got to thank you first, though, for doing this with me. And I'm so honored to be in conversation with you and love your work, and I've learned so much from it. I also have to recognize librarians in the room who are not just on the forefront of knowledge and culture creation, but on the forefront of poverty abolition. You know, the library remains one of the only free spaces in American life left. It's a place where you can apply for a job, learn another language, use the bathroom without people roughing you up. So I just thank all the librarians in the room for everything you do for folks in the community, including folks that are struggling. I think poverty, you know, is often talked about as something that's out there. It's someone else's problem. You know, sometimes many of us blame the poor for their own miseries, but that kind of action has fallen out of fashion, at least in towns like this, and we often blame Congress or the other political party or like the guy that's like a little richer than us. And I think that I've become more and more suspicious of those absolving theories of poverty. And I think poverty is a relationship of predation, and often it is a relationship that many of us benefit from in our daily lives, unwittingly, sometimes wittingly, in the choices we make about what we buy, what we invest in, where we live. We're kind of embroiled in this problem, which means we're also connected to the solution.
So let's get a little more uncomfortable, because I think that's one of the things that this book does so beautifully, is it forces a reckoning with the ways in which we are complicit. Can we talk about that? What are some of the ways that everyone in this room might recognize we are participating in the existence and the proliferation of poverty in America?
Many of us consume the cheap goods and services the working poor produce. Many of us are invested in the stock market, indirectly or directly. Don't we benefit when we see our savings go up and up, even when that comes at the cost of a human sacrifice. Many of us benefit from this imbalanced welfare state that we have, this fact that the country does so much more to subsidize affluence than to alleviate poverty. We benefit from that.
The invisible, you call it the invisible welfare state in your book.
Yeah, yeah.
What is that?
Well, I mean, let's speak really concretely and little wonkishly about this. So those of us who are homeowners, we are entitled. We have an entitlement to deduct the interest of our mortgage from our tax bill every year. And last year we spent $193 billion on homeowner tax subsidies. Most of those benefits went to families with six-figure incomes. Most white families in America own their home. Most Black and Latinx families don't because of our systematic dispossession of people of color from the land. And that same year, we spent $190 billion on homeowner tax subsidies. We only spent $53 billion on direct housing assistance to the needy. So like a 15-story public housing complex and a mortgaged suburban home are both government subsidized. Just one looks and feels that way. I think we need to start reckoning with that, recognizing that. And that's another way that many of us kind of participate in the game of poverty. We protect those tax breaks, which means we starve anti-poverty spending.
And when we talk about tax breaks, often people sort of can gain, take some distance and say, okay, that's a kind of abstract thing, but maybe we can make it even more relatable. I mean, isn't it also taking Uber? Isn't it also, there's a way in which every single day people are participating in a workforce that is creating very exploitative conditions.
Right, and we know this. Right? We can feel this. This is something that really moved me in your book, and I heard you talking about it recently as well. You talk about this thing called emotional violence. Yeah.
And I wondered if I could share with you all, and you actually should read it, but it's this one paragraph in which you say, consider all the raw talent and beauty and brilliance that we squander by requiring that tens of millions of Americans expend so much energy just trying to make it from one day to the next. And then you cite the study in 2019 that finds that children from rich families were 10 times as likely to become inventors than children from families on the bottom half of the income and distribution, and that researchers attributed this gap to environmental factors, not to differences in innate abilities, by showing that young children from low-income families who scored high in math, which turns out to be very predictive in terms of who becomes an inventor, were much less likely to become inventors than wealthier children with similar math scores. So what conclusion did researchers draw from that? That there are many lost Einsteins. And this notion that poverty reduces people born for better things. I wonder if you could just talk about that, and if you could talk about some of the people you met along the way. Maybe Julio.
Sure. So I met Julio Paez in Emeryville, California a few years ago. He was living in a small apartment that he shared with his mom and his younger brother, Alexander. And he was working two jobs. He would start the night shift at McDonald's, working 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. And then he'd have 2 hours to rest and shower, and then he'd clock in at Aerotech, going anywhere the temp service sent him between 8 a.m. and 4 p.m. And then he'd sleep as much as he could, and it was back to McDonald's, and each job paid minimum wage. And he didn't have a life. He was just either working or sleeping. And one day, Alexander, who was 8 at the time, went to Julio and said, I'm saving up my money, how much for an hour to play with me? And when Julio heard that, he just wept. And then not long after that, he collapsed in the aisle of a grocery store just from sheer exhaustion. He was 24 years old. So when we talk about poverty and what we take from people, what we're talking about really is robbing them of life and health and beauty and relationships. And I think that when we think about poverty in those terms, it should feel more morally urgent to us than often that it does. And so you're right. I mean, when we think of how much more vibrant and thriving our country could be without poverty, I think of how many journalists and artists and poets and preachers and diplomats and scientists poverty is stolen from us, which, I think drives home this idea that the end of poverty isn't just something to stand for and strive for the millions and millions of folks below the line, but it's something to reach for because it would make us a better country. All of us would benefit from the end of poverty.
And I think anyone listening to right now would agree with that. And yet there is this other attitude that is taken, this other posture towards the poor. And this is something that has persisted through many generations in America, this notion that the poor are to blame, the politics of responsibility, that they are to blame for their condition. I'm wondering if you can talk about that a little bit, and how does your book call that into question or force a reckoning with that?
I don't think we believe that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we say, it's like when you get married, when you get engaged and someone's like, just gives you advice. And then pretty soon you're like, they don't believe that. They're just saying things to me.
Right.
And I think that that's how we often talk about poverty. It's like what Hannah Arendt says about propaganda. It's not that people believed it, but it organized people. And I think that the more that we can shift the debate and be like, we're just not having that conversation. We're having this conversation over here, I think can get us to a different place. There's this line in the book that I love that I always quote. It's by the novelist Tommy Orange.
Yeah.
Where he says, it's like these kids are jumping out of the windows of burning buildings, falling to their deaths, and we think that the problem is that they're jumping. And it's like, that's like the American poverty debate. So the more that we can focus on the fire and who lit it, who's warming their hands by it, I think it can get us to another place. I'm happy to go into the myths and dispel the myths, but when you do that, it's kind of like you let someone else control the conversation. And so I'm wrestling with the degree to which we give those questions air and the degree to which we say, no, we're focused on the fire now.
Well, so part of the fight for control when it comes to the poverty conversation relates to how even to define it. And I want to specifically ask you about a puzzle that you identify in the book, which is this contrast between anti-poverty spending going up over the last 40 years, and yet the poverty line, as you define it, remaining flat. Tell me a little bit about how you would frame that, and what potentially another perspective or a critical pushback to that might say, and what you would say to that, because I think there's been a lot of conversation around this.
Yeah, this is a really important question. We have to lean into this question. We're going to get a little wonky. We're going to get a little wonky, but we're not going to stay wonky all night. Or, unless you want to, that's fine. We can stay wonky. And so when I started looking into the persistence of poverty in America, one thing I thought was maybe we stop spending on the poor. And because I come at this through housing, through housing, that's exactly what happened. Ronald Reagan cut the budget for public housing by 70%, 70%. We just gutted these programs. And so I thought that was happening to all these programs, but it's not true. Actually, it's not true. If you look at the 13th biggest means tested programs, spending on those went from about $1,000 per person the first year Ronald Reagan was elected to about $3,400 per person the first year Donald Trump was. It's a 237% increase in anti-poverty spending adjusted for inflation. Deeper investments. And so you look at the official poverty line, it hasn't moved over 50 years, really. But the official poverty line is troubled. It's problematic. It doesn't account for a lot of those programs that we've been spending more money on. So when you do that through this thing called the supplemental poverty measure, you basically find the same thing. So the supplemental poverty rate, 1973, 50 years ago, is about 15%, and 40 years later, it was 15%. It dropped a little lower in COVID, before COVID, then it plunged in COVID because of this historic investment in the American people that the Biden administration made. But then it started ticking back up. So those two lines tell the same story. And what makes people really nervous about the story is, wait, if you're saying that poverty hasn't moved, what you're also saying is those government programs don't work. And I want to be really clear that I am not saying that. And there's a deeper story. We're burying the lead, I think.
What is the lead?
The lead is we're spending more to stay in the same place. And so the paradox that we have to lean into and embrace if we're going to get serious about ending poverty in America is government programs work, They're effective and essential. They protect thousands, millions of people from homelessness and hunger every year. Government spending on those programs has increased in real terms, and the poverty line, measured in all sorts of different ways, has remained the same. And other hardship measures that should trouble us, like evictions and the number of families that are going to food pantries, like these other actual hardship measures are going up. And so that's the paradox we have to lean into. And how does that make sense? And it makes sense because the job market isn't pulling its weight, and because the housing market and financial markets are incredibly exploitative to poor families today. And unless we address that, like this unrelenting exploitation of the poor, we're gonna stay on the same hamster wheel. So if you want to get really wonky, just to close this loop, let me just real quick. So if you look at what's happened with federal housing assistance over the last 20 years, spending on everything we do for federal housing assistance has gone up about 15% in real terms, like actual increase. So you might think, oh, more families are getting housing assistance, but it's not true.
It's only 3% of Americans actually have access to like federal subsidies, and it's very small.
It's very small. I mean, most families who qualify for this kind of aid don't get it. And about 20 years ago, 4.5 million families benefited, and today, 4.5 million families benefit. But we're spending more.
Spending more to stay
Why?
in the same place.
How? And it's because rents have gone up about 15% in real terms during that time, and many of the things we're doing to help those families interact with the private market. So again, like unless we get those costs under control, this is kind of the hamster wheel we're gonna be on.
What is the connection you would draw between abolishing poverty and confronting racism?
Direct, like intimate. It's impossible to write a book called Poverty by America without writing a book that's also about racism in America. And the story of dividing low-income families from each other through race has been like the American story for the last 200 years. You know, Du Bois wrote about it after slavery ended, and how poor whites, even though slavery took their land and dispossessed them, still got paid a psychological wage, is he in his words, right? This kind of idea, well, I'm white though, I can get some cash on that. Or you look at the American labor movement, right? And you ask, like, why didn't the labor movement rise up and become like a party, like it did in France or England today? And the reason is the old labor was really racist and exclusionary, and old labor shot themselves in the foot by barring Black and Latinx workers from their ranks. So all these kind of turns in American society, we have to confront racism along with confronting poverty.
Can you just talk, now I'm gonna get a little wonky, but in a writerly way. So the one thing I love about this book is the comma in the title.
Yeah.
Poverty by America.
Yeah.
So talk about the title and what makes this, is this a very particular kind of poverty that is unique to America? Or is this just a book that tries to raise a kind of consciousness about what's happening in America?
Yeah. I got this title when I was in the airport once, and you know when you're in the airport, there's like all those Chanel ads, and it'll be like, Breeze, number 5, by Chanel. And there's like a comma. And I just thought, poverty by America. You know? And you know, I think that it's a little cheeky, but it's effective. You know, it's kind of like we created this.
Right.
And this is of our doing. And American poverty is different than poverty in other rich democracies. First of all, there's just more of it.
Why? Why is it so different? Why do we have the highest poverty rate of any advanced democracy? Why is that the case?
Why do we have a poor population that if they founded a country, that population would have a bigger size than Australia? Like, why do 1 in 3 of us live in households making $55,000 or less? You know, why is our child poverty rate double Germany and South Korea and Canada? Why do over 5 million of us live in abject poverty by global standards, according to the Nobel laureate Angus Deaton? Because many of us benefit from this arrangement. And that's like a rude explanation, but I think that's the truth. And you know, we benefit in our daily lives, and some lives are made small so that others may grow. And so, you know, the book's has this opening line by Tolstoy, and it comes from this strange book that he wrote kind of toward the end of his career, where he was moved to Moscow from the countryside, and he saw all this poverty around him, and he's like, what is going on? Why? And he was like, maybe the poor aren't working hard enough. And he's like, no, they're working nonstop, actually. They can't stop working. And maybe it's this, maybe it's that. And they went down all these rabbit holes, and he finally just was like, it's me. It's my people, you know? And he has this line like, I sit on a man's back, choking him, and I want to do everything to help him except getting off his back, you know? And I think that for those of us that have found some privilege and security in America, it's really time for us to take some accountability, I think.
Is this a disavowal of capitalism? And I know you're going to say no, and I want to quote you before I ask you our next question, but I just want to put that out there because one could listen to you and say, what is he really espousing? What I've heard you say is that in America we have what you call a low road capitalism, and we need a high road capitalism. What would that look like?
It's, you know, like 1 out of 2 book talks I'm giving now, a person younger than me will stand up and ask the capitalism question. The young folks are done with capitalism. It's interesting. It's interesting, right? They're at a different place than not young folks are on this question.
Do they ask it without baggage? It's like a different kind of asking.
It's a beautiful moral statement, I think, is what they're making. And they're basically seeing an economy that's not working. You know, they're seeing $100,000 college degrees in possibly expensive cities and all these things, and they're asking these fundamentals about what we're doing. I think that we can get to a different kind of capitalism and deliver to that next generation a capitalism that serves the people, not the other way around, a high road capitalism. So a high road capitalism would be a capitalism with worker representation. You know, we're like going down all these kind of technological breakthroughs today, and it's totally undemocratic. We're like, what's gonna happen with AI? We don't know, but are workers having a say? No. You know, workers could be on corporate boards, so they can have a say. We could make unionizing easy instead of incredibly hard. We could organize entire sectors instead of going one Starbucks to another, as we do today. We could raise the minimum wage, which hasn't been raised in 13 years and counting. And we can commission Congress to not just do it the next time they get around to it. You know, most countries, they have like a board that raises the minimum wage automatically, adjusting for inflation, not us. And so I think that we could, you know, construct a job market that delivers for the American people. And if you look what happened 60 years ago, right? If you look what happened when they launched the War on Poverty and the Great Society, these massive investments in the poorest families that cut poverty in half, they did that during a time when unions were strong, right? 1 in 3 workers were in a union. Wages were climbing. You had some benefits. You could advance in a company. And now we've moved to a place where unions are weak and, you know, wages are stagnant for a lot of folks, especially without a college degree. And that's why we need this like 1-2 punch that we had in the 60s that we don't have today.
Well, more recently during the pandemic, we got a glimpse of what it can look like when the government lifts up people. And specifically with the child tax credit, we saw child poverty drop by half.
Yeah.
And then it ended.
Yeah.
So what do you make of that? Is that about a lack of political willpower? Is it a broader symptom of disconnect between America and this problem? Or how do you explain that? We actually saw a tremendous benefit happening to the lives of poor children in that period, and then it evaporated.
Yeah. I mean, this makes me so angry and sad. So child tax credit cut child poverty by 46% in 6 months. 6 months.
3.5 million or 3.6 million kids a month were lifted out of poverty.
It was the most important thing we've done for poor families since the Great Society. Emergency rental assistance reduced evictions to the lowest they've ever been on record, ever, months and months and months after the eviction moratorium ended. These historic, powerful, meaty investments in poor families, finally, you know, after years and years of inaction. And man, we were quiet. We were quiet. And, you know, if you look at just the emergency rental assistance program, We have, COVID hits, America gets an eviction crisis. We're the only rich democracy that gets an eviction crisis along with the pandemic. It's not like Germany suddenly had an eviction crisis. We did. And so a moratorium got put in place. It lasted almost a year. It decreased COVID deaths by 11%, according to a study out of Duke. But the rent was building up, the rent bill, right? So everyone's like, what's gonna happen when that moratorium gets lifted? And so the federal government dedicated $46.5 billion to rental relief. That's like doubling HUD's budget. But it turns out you can't drop $46 billion from a plane, and so states had to distribute this through distribution channels that had to be created by scratch. And when this was happening, some states did it well, and other states didn't, and it was sputtering and stumbling getting out the door, and everyone was tweeting about it, and everyone was writing about it. The New York Times called it slow as molasses aid. Planet Money did a show called The Rent Relief is Too Damn Slow. But then it started reaching families, and it reached 1 million, and then 2 million, and then 5 million, and then 10 million, and evictions plummeted. And this is what we said about it. We said, nothing about it. And I think that
you write about this also, that there was this narrative at the same time about workers not showing up for work because they suddenly had this boosted income from the government and therefore wanted to live off the government. That was the narrative.
Yeah.
But what people never talk about is how hard those jobs were, the conditions of those jobs. What were they not showing up for?
One of the most moving parts of the reporting during the pandemic is hearing workers who are benefiting from staying home saying things like, I haven't taken a nap in 15 years. My feet stopped hurting. Just basic, we're breaking people's bodies, and them getting a break. And then, all we can do, right, is just kind of say, this extra $300 a month is the thing that's keeping people home. But it just wasn't true. When the job market numbers were released in August, and we compared states that got rid of some of the benefits and states that kept them, the job market numbers were basically the same. And so, and if you dig into the data just on a normal year, you learn that the biggest problem isn't welfare dependency like that, but welfare avoidance. The fact that low-income families are leaving billions and billions and billions on the table each year because we're doing a terrible job connecting them to programs that they need and deserve.
We are going to be opening up for questions, which I believe you guys can write down on index cards and they'll be handed to me. So I just want to invite you to add your questions to the mix. What do you mean, Matt, when you say that you are a poverty abolitionist? What does it mean to be an abolitionist?
I think poverty abolitionism shares with other abolitionist movements like the movement to abolish slavery or the prison, the conviction that poverty isn't a minor social ill or something we have to live with in post-industrial capitalism, but is an abomination. It cannot be tolerated. And it shares with other abolitionist movements the conviction that profiting from someone else's pain corrupts all of us. So those of us that take on this identity and this perspective, it's a personal project and a political project. We seek to divest from poverty in our consumer choices, in our investment decisions. We support a government that makes deeper investments in fighting poverty and stops doing so much to guard fortunes. We detest all forms of exploitation, even those kinds that we benefit from.
Can you talk a little bit more about the guarding of fortunes and how that specifically relates to
So we just experienced tax season, right? We just paid our taxes. And if you're like me and everyone else in America, you were like, crap, I have to pay my taxes. And we probably had these conversations at dinner, in the water cooler, and this makes sense because the way we do taxes in America is very painful. And their taxes should hurt, like Reagan famously said. But what if we did something else next tax season? What if the next time your neighbor leaned over the fence or found you in the elevator and they're like, oh my God, taxes. What if we said things like, you know what's crazy? I'm saving for college for my kid. And I get this tax deduction, but I can only save for college because I'm well off. And this is kind of crazy how we design our welfare state, right? Or I own a home now. And maybe next tax season when I have this conversation, I'm gonna say, you know what's crazy? I can get this thing called the mortgage interest deduction, even though we have like an eviction crisis going on. So I'm gonna donate what I get from that deduction this year to like legal defense, and I'm gonna write my congressperson saying like, roll this thing back, I don't need this. Those are awkward conversations in the elevator. But that's kind of how we change the common sense. And I think that means us kind of evaluating how we're connected to a government that does a lot more to subsidize affluence than to alleviate poverty, and then has the audacity and shamelessness to tell stories about poor people's dependency on government aid and shoot down proposals because they would cost too much. You know, I can't get over this study that I read a few years ago that showed that if the top 1% of us just paid the taxes they owed, not got taxed more, just did what they should, we could raise an additional $175 billion a year extra for the public purse. That is more than enough money to reinstate the child tax credit. Mm-hmm. That is enough money to double our investment in affordable housing and still have money left over. That's almost enough money to pull everyone up under the official poverty line above it. So this idea, this scarcity mindset that we've kind of become trapped in, where we like are swallowing the lie that the richest country in the history of the world can't afford to do more, I think we have to cultivate a language that pushes back against that.
And by the way, we say we can't afford to do more, but we are paying for poverty, aren't we? We're just paying for it on the back end.
Yeah.
In so many ways.
Yeah, we are.
And that's another thing that people don't seem to have, it's kind of gone missing from the conversation in terms of incarceration, in terms of even just health problems that are related to correlated to poverty. You talked about the bandwidth tax in your book and the experience of being poor. And I know you have made a really forthright decision to focus on the relationship between the poor and everyone else rather than focusing on the lives of the poor in this book, which differs actually as a narrative choice from Evicted. They're very different kinds of books, although this does still read like a page turner, I will say. Impressively so, and it's now in week 5 on the bestseller list in the New York Times. It really seems to have struck a chord.
Yeah.
And you've been out there, you've been for 5 weeks now talking all over America. Can you share with us some of the ways in which you think it has reached people? What is it about this book that is keeping it on the bestseller list? I mean, it's a book about poverty.
Yeah.
I was laughing about it with your wife. She's like, I mean, he wrote a book, it literally has the word poverty as the first word, and it's on the bestseller list.
Yeah.
It's sort of extraordinary.
Yeah, me and the Prince.
Yeah, you and Harry.
Yeah. I launched this book in Nashville, Tennessee at Ann Patchett's bookstore, and someone drove 11 hours to be at the event. And I went to LA, someone flew from Milwaukee to be at the event. I was like, I'm gonna be in Chicago next week. I was in Cleveland, someone drove from Pittsburgh. I don't think this has anything to do with me at all, or this book even. I think this has to do with this hunger we have in this country to finally confront this issue. I think we want our political leaders to say the word poverty. I think that many of us are, feel our connection to this issue, on a day-to-day basis, and are done with it. It offends our sense of dignity in a way. And so I think that it's like that old Gramsci line that the old is dying, but the new hasn't been reborn yet. But I think that there's a lot of potential in this moment right now in this country to really confront this issue that so many of us, left and right, really care about.
So here's a question. This person writes, you spoke about young people's disavowal of capitalism. As a young person myself, I think the underlying feeling is hopelessness.
Right.
How do you keep up hope that can change the system, that we can change the system?
Yeah. Yeah, I get it. But our hopelessness is useless. It's useless. And so we have to push through it. It was pretty hopeless in the 60s. Congress was a mess. The Dixiecrats were aligned with Republicans to block civil rights legislation. Government obstructionism wasn't just the outcome, it was like the goal. It was by design. Sound familiar? And And then even in that moment of political polarization and division and racism, we got major pieces of civil rights legislation, and we got the modern social safety net in the terms of the war on society, or war on poverty and great society. And if so much was accomplished despite the odds, it was because movements pushed. They pushed and pushed, especially the civil rights and labor movements, and put unrelenting pressure on Congress. I should say this is from, I'm convinced of this argument through a historian, Julian Zalazar, in his amazing book, The Fierce Urgency of Now. And I think that today as then, our hope lies with the movements, and also like our joy lies with the movements. And if you're looking for like meaning in a way to fight big problems without getting hopeless, join the anti-poverty movement. I was spending time with this group called United Renters for Justice right before COVID hit. Tenants in Minneapolis, a lot of them were undocumented. They communicated across Google Translate app on their phone. They spoke a lot of different languages. Had a neglectful landlord and started mobilizing against him. And he would move to evict someone. Everyone would show up from the community during their eviction. They bring tamales and pizza, like, you know, they would sing songs. The landlord attorney would be like, "Can I have a tamale?" They'd be like, "No, you can't have a tamale." And they mobilized and fought, and they actually won. They bought the buildings back from their landlord and turned it into cooperative housing, which is still going on today. And, you know, I was talking to a woman named Chloe Jackson, who was part of that movement, and she wasn't like a political person. She was like just a single mom working at the airport for $15 an hour. And she started getting involved, and she became a leader. And she was like, "Look, when I started, these were just my neighbors, and now they're my family." And doesn't that sound like a thing we want to be, like an American life we want to be a part of? So I think the hope is in the movements historically, but also just on a spiritual level today too.
Okay, so New York City, is another person is writing this, is considering a near 16% rent rise on stabilized apartments.
I know, right?
This is one example of the pivotal point of the housing crisis in big cities. Advice for residents and electeds, what does this underscore?
I mean, a 16% rent rise in rent stabilized housing is really bananas. And I think that if you've ever gone to a rent board meeting, if you haven't, you should. Because a lot of the property owners will stand up and they'll be like, "This rent stabilization is killing us. It's putting us out of business." And the rent board says, "Sir, have you filled out a hardship form, an economic hardship form?" And then the property owner sits down. And so I think that you know, we've got to hold on to the protections we have in this city. 1 in 5 folks that live in public housing in America lives in this city. This city is one of the last vestiges of rent stabilization in America. And you know, if we lose it here, we're going to lose it all over. So I think that, look, as a researcher too, there's a way of approaching this and saying, well, what are the returns landlords are getting? And we don't know the answer to that question. Some of the research that I've done on this shows that landlords in poor neighborhoods are not just making more than landlords in affluent neighborhoods, they're making double. They're making double. And the reason is the costs are a lot lower, but rents are not that much lower. And I know this might blow your mind in New York City, but New York City's weird. Like where most other Americans live, this is how it is. And so I think that asking questions about like, how can we give property owners a decent rate of return, a fair rate of return, and how can we protect families' like absolute essential need for housing, that's become way out of balance in cities like New York.
Another person writes, can you please speak to geographic spatial differentials? So is one region or type of region, example, the coasts, benefiting from exploitation versus another region, example, the middle of the country? Do cities benefit from exploiting rural areas, or does it even out through other programs?
Man, I wish it even out. That would be amazing. I think this is a national problem. I think that, you know, if you're thinking of, you know, one place to really talk about, which we haven't talked about yet today, is just segregation, which is another big part of the book and another big cause of poverty. Many of us, and I'm really talking to like the white affluent folks in the room here, and this isn't just a political point, just like an empirical point. We build walls around our communities, and we hoard affluence behind those walls. And that creates concentrations of wealth, but also concentrations of poverty outside of our walls. And
your last chapter, I think, is called Tear Down Our Walls.
we have to tear down the walls.
How do we do that?
Well, we could start showing up at zoning board meetings at Tuesday night, and we can start rising from our seats and being like, this community's longstanding tradition of segregation ends with me, and I refuse to deny other kids opportunities that my kids have got living here. Let's build this thing. On most residential land in America, it's illegal to build anything other than a single detached family home. That's a rural issue, that's a coastal issue, that's a southern issue, that's a northern issue. And so I think this is one place where like the exploitation of the poor, the spatial exploitation of the poor is not just different than the neighborhoods we live in, or some of us live in, but are connected to those neighborhoods. You know, this is a way that the concentration of affluence can breed poverty.
Why, in talking about poverty, is the argument against it more often moral than economic?
The argument against ending poverty? Yeah. Why is it moral than economic? I wonder if it is. I don't know. I mean, we're certainly seeing a lot of traction in the Poor People's Campaign, you know, with Reverend Barber saying, you know, this should be a moral movement. And I think that what he's doing with that language is you know, trying to break down silos and trying to like generate what he calls a fusion politics and have a morality against poverty and deprivation. I have a little bit of a aversion to just straight economic arguments about ending poverty because sometimes they strike me as everyone wins arguments. You know, like,
Yeah.
And look, I think sometimes those arguments ring false because they are. And I'm calling for some of us to sacrifice.
Right.
I'm calling for some of us to take less from the government. I'm calling for less rich aid and deeper investments in poverty. And those of us that have a mortgage interest deduction like me, they're frankly nice to have, you know, if you can get it. You know, and so I'm calling for that. But what I'm calling for also is an America that's safer, that's more vibrant, that's fairer. And I think that a lot of us are pining for that country. There's an old quote in a book called The Book of Sands, and it goes like this, something like this. If you want your people to build a boat, don't assemble your team and don't gather the wood, but make them long for the edge of the sea. And I think that part of our work in poverty abolitionism is to convince us that this is a better country for you, me, and everyone. Now, you might have to take a little hit on your tax bill, you know, but don't we want, like, isn't the end better than the thing we're going to give up? And I think the answer is yes. So I also think that there's a lot of, you know, I think there's a lot of levers to pull, and if you want to make that econ argument out there with your neighbor or your congressperson, go for it.
Well, may we all long for the edge of the sea. Thank you, Matt. I think we're out of time. Maybe we have time for a few more questions.
I
don't know.
have no idea.
I don't know because they don't tell us what time it is
it's
up
like
here.
how it just
Well, you're going to sign books, and
I'm gonna sign books.
you can answer more questions as you do that, I suppose. Oh, we have more questions. Okay, I guess
right.
we're not going anywhere. Okay,
I
not
like how
yet.
she's like, you're gonna
okay.
stay. You're gonna stay, buddy.
You've spoken about the link between poverty and race. Can you speak about the link between poverty and gender, particularly post-COVID?
Post-COVID, well, one of the, I was thinking of it more as post-Roe. And, you know, I visited an abortion clinic in Philly right before the fall of Roe, and spoke with the technicians, spoke with folks that are getting women financial aid there, and, you know, the waiting room was full of folks that are struggling, you know? And, you know, this is a poverty issue. You know, there's a famous study called the Turnaway Study that's, the evidence is very strong and convincing. It was a groundbreaking study when it came out, but it basically it followed women who had sought abortions and compared those that were right over the cutoff, like right over the limit to receive an abortion with those who could receive the procedure, and followed those women and their children for years. And they found that, the women who were denied abortions, much higher rates of poverty. Years later, their children, much higher rates of poverty than the kids who would be born later for the women that had abortions. So it just convinced me that if one of our solutions to poverty is expanding people's choice, right? And that's kind of what anti-exploitation capitalism is, expanding our choice and power. Reproductive choice also has to be part of that conversation.
Okay, and I think this is a good closing question. What would you say is the most important lesson from the book for organizers and social movement organizations to take away? What challenge would you issue to them?
Oh, grow. Grow. Recruit us. Expand the tent. I think keep pushing, keep working. We love you. For those of you in the audience who are not organizing, I have a website for you. So we launched a website along with a book called endpovertyusa.org. It's like endpovertyusa.org. And it does two simple things. It connects families to services they need and deserve in their community, and it's designed to connect all of us to anti-poverty organizations working in New York or New Jersey, if you live in the best state, or at the national level, and get involved. And like, I don't think of myself as an organizing person, and maybe you don't either, but like organizers need lawyers and need nurses and accountants and like advertising people. What's that? Money. They need money too. They need your money. And they need even a writer or two, maybe. And so I just encourage you to get plugged in and learn what these organizations doing and help them grow the tent. And to be in relationship. And to be in relationship, yeah. Not a relationship of... With your communities. Yeah, with a genuine relationship. A genuine one. Yeah. I think that when we're in relationship with folks who are struggling and folks that are facing these issues that we talk about tonight, they become non-abstract issues, right? And so your problems become your problems. Yeah, you become accountable in a different way, right? Yep. And so in the book, I write about like my friend Wu or my friend Crystal, and I call them my friends because they're my friends. Yeah. They're not my research subjects, they're my friends. And I think that when you have those kind of genuine relationships, I think you see and tack to these issues with a complete different level of energy and commitment, and also like these vague abstractions that often are floating around the poverty debate often look silly, next to real human beings living complex lives. Well, here's to being real while living a complex existence. Thank you, Matt. Thank you so much. Yeah.